Hello, everybody, and thank you for tuning in to the Liberty Report. This is the day we do the program called Mythbusters. Co-host today is Chris Rossini, who is also the editor of the Ron Paul Liberty Report website.com. Chris, good to see you today.
Good morning, Dr. Paul. Great to be with you.
Good. I imagine there's a couple myths that we can deal with, misinformation, confusion. It seems like that's all I hear about during the presidential campaign. So I guess you found a few for us this week.
Yes, I did, and we'll start with the most bizarre. As we know, cultural Marxism, political correctness is running wild across the country, and apparently there's a new branch that we can, jokingly call bathroom correctness. And I saw reported on TargetLiberty.com this week some really interesting news that there's actually a government website in Washington, D.C., where people can go to it and report private businesses that don't offer gender-neutral bathrooms. Now, Dr. Paul, is this an area that government has any business in, and are we moving to a time where private people are going to have to are going to be forced to allow a grown man to share a bathroom with a little girl?
Well, it is if you have rejected the whole notion of common sense. If you throw common sense out the window and simple morality, then I guess you can come up with anything. No, it's absolutely ridiculous. And if you're a federal official, you should say, well, I wonder where this is in the Constitution. Oh, yeah, I'll read Article 1, Section 8 and see if it has something there about gender neutrality. And what does gender neutrality mean? You know, I spent a lot of time in medicine, and I happen to have studied and practiced gynecology. You know, I had trouble finding this gender neutrality. You know, there is a difference. You know, it's emotional and physical, and I had no trouble screening my patients, and nobody complained, and the patients were quite happy. So this whole thing is nonsense. But it boils down to where the myth is that property ownership is not a civil liberty, and this came out from the law that was passed in 1964, which has, bit me a bit, because even though I wasn't anywhere close to voting for that, I agreed with those who opposed it because they said it would undermine private property. And that's exactly what it did. It did some other good things, like getting rid of government-mandated discrimination and Jim Crow laws and these sorts of things. But then to say that, private property was not a protection. And so they sort of put the nail in the coffin of dividing up social, personal liberties with economic liberties, and that there was no such thing as private property. But when it comes to bathrooms, does anybody say to us, well, you have a bathroom in your house, and I'm out here and I need a bathroom, so I want to come in, and you have to oblige to have that person come in, and also gender neutrality was important, and the how this person presents himself. No, nobody would think that would be possible, that nobody does it. But when it comes to a public ownership of anything else, there's no such thing as private property. It's publicly owned. It's dealt by the public, and somebody else will decide, what liberty means. And liberty to many people under these circumstances mean that they can do what they want. So they come along with these arbitrary problems and discrimination and say, we are going to discriminate against the large majority, and say that certain men can go to the bathroom with little girls. It just makes no sense whatsoever. And it's so unnecessary too, because all they have to do is recognize the fact that private property is a civil liberty, and the ownership of the bathroom ought to be able to determine, just like he determines who uses the bathroom in his own house. But this is where liberals and do-gooders and socialists say, oh no, property is the property of the common good. But they want to define the common good and the common use and what the rules are. And that's why they reject the whole notion of libertarianism and freedom of choice. They really are rejecting freedom of choice. And they come down on the side of authoritarianism, and then all of a sudden there's a conflict. One person's authoritarian approach is different than the other person, and they reject this whole notion of freedom of choice and a solution to problems, in a voluntary voluntary manner. And it's been handled that way for many, many years. It's just recently, and I think this whole idea where social Marxism is a good term. It's the use of force to intimidate people to certain values that they don't endorse, and there will always be a difference. That's why the libertarian society is so advantageous. It allows people to do what they want on their own terms as long as they never use force. And under those conditions, you can have all kinds of bathrooms and do whatever you want on your private property, but you can't intimidate and make other people, obey and follow the rules that you design and say, well, it's public and we're going to write the rules for the public. So this whole myth could be solved by just understanding that private property is a civil liberty, and people who own property can make their own decision with how it's to be used.
Yes, and all those crazy rules, they get lumped into a mythical contract that's often referred to as a social contract, and we'll cover that one next. Now, there are many, many people that love living under the biggest government on the planet, and they often tell libertarians, you know what, if you don't like it, then you can just get out. We live under this social contract, it's called. But Dr. Paul, I don't remember signing any contract, and I would love to see anybody's signature on it. So please dispel this myth of this social contract.
Well, I tell you what, with that presentation there, it makes you think about Lysander Spooner, because he spent a lifetime trying to point this out. He didn't sign the Constitution. Why do I have to obey the Constitution? And who put me into this social contract? But the social contract has never been the evil that it is seen today and the abuse of today, because this was a big issue for Socrates. But even back then, in those early days of trying to figure these things out, a lot of it was voluntary. The community came together, and if you decided that you wanted to belong to a city-state, you did it by joining and saying, I will follow these rules. So a little bit that you can see that as acceptable. And then if you decided you didn't want to follow these rules anymore, you left the community. And it's interesting to note that even John Locke had a sympathy for that, and the people who wrote the Constitution talked about the social contract and the consent of the people. And when the consent is libertarian, it sounds good, it's very tolerant, but when the consent is by socialists and authoritarians, the consent comes down from the Bernie Sanders of the world with massive forced redistribution of wealth. So then all of a sudden it's a much bigger challenge. And but the social contract today is so abused, and the public good is defined by a few people. But I think it is interesting to think about Lysander Spooner, because he was an interesting person, because he strongly objected to the Constitution, and he was very, very libertarian, leaning toward anarchy. And then, but he despised. He was an abolitionist. He hated slavery. He identified with the South, during that time, and yet his biggest challenge was, the social contracts, who signed me up to be part of this system. And even though things weren't as bad back then as they are now, his suspicions were right. And even the Anti-Federalists at the time of our Constitution being written had these same concerns. Well, this consent business may get out of control, and we shouldn't allow this to happen. Maybe we'll write the Bill of Rights, and that will help contain it. But it really didn't work well. And so the social contract now is totally out of control. It sounds good. It's sort of, do it for humanitarian reasons. We want to do good for the people, free medicine, and that's the social contract. And you who are able to produce, you must produce and take care of these people. So that is what has to be challenged. But the only social contract that I think I would endorse is the voluntary contract, purely so, without any official government. And this could be the individual ought to be able to have a social contract with themselves. If he honestly earns his own property, he ought to be allowed to just mind his own business. But the social contract could even be a lot larger. You could have a small community and say, well, if you want to live into our condominium or whatnot, we're going to share certain things, and that could be a form of a social contract, but it would be just an ordinary contract. You wouldn't have to be bogged down with the term of social contract, which means obedience to somebody's notion of how you have to sacrifice yourself for other people and why you have to endorse the tax code and the redistribution of wealth, which leads to, guess what? The people who are in the driver's seat, like the very wealthy, get to write all the rules and all the tax codes and get all the bailouts, promote all the wars. So the social contract today is a total disaster, but the basic principle of voluntarism is quite different. It's interesting that if you read closely what Socrates said, he believed that if you join, you should stick to their guns. As a matter of fact, Spooner even said, while the Constitution is in place, just for public order, he would obey it. But he believed it was wrong and would lead to a disaster. He was absolutely right. So the principle of social contract should be challenged, but it also means that we all should look into and study and understand it and have the alternative, what kind of a contract we should have. And I like the contract that brings people together where they commit and say they will not use aggression against any other individual. And believe me, that type of a social contract would work out pretty well. Today, the myth is the social contract that we're being used is totally abused and should be repealed.
Yes. Next, Dr. Paul. Today is April 22nd, and it's a major religious holiday for those who worship the government. It is Earth Day, and that leads into our next topic. Apparently, many Americans go to work every day to have their earnings extricated from them and handed over to the UN, to a specific UN climate agency. And this is just one of the many, many, many boondoggles that Americans fund. And there's news that Republican Senator John Barrasso from Wyoming is threatening to cut this funding to this UN climate agency. Now, before getting all excited, we should look into the reason as to why he wants to cut it. And his reason is he wants to cut this funding to the climate agency because this agency recognizes the state of Palestine as a full member. Dr. Paul, where do you start with this one?
Well, the myth is why even deal with United Nations and give it credibility? We should take the constitutional position, the practical position, and one of the idiocy of some of the social contracts that we have is say that we shouldn't be there, and that should be the issue, and the funding should be cut. So we would agree with them on that. But to use this as a tool to go ahead and re-emphasize a foreign policy tip point, that will go after the Palestinians because they're, we were asked about that in the presidential campaign. Are the Palestinians a people? Well, last I remember reading about it, I heard that Palestinians have been around for a few years. But no, are they a people? They're not to be considered a people. Now, the interesting thing is this has ramifications that are much more than people realize. Because, after 9/11, if anybody cared to read what the motivation might have been, other than the fact that they hated us because we were free and prosperous, and read, wonder what bin Laden had to say about 9/11. He said, well, there's 3 reasons why we're bitter. You went and put military troops on our holy land in Saudi Arabia, and we don't like that. For 10 years, you've been bombing an Arab Muslim country, Iraq, and killing a lot of innocent people to the tune of hundreds of thousands. We don't like that, and we think you unfairly punished the Palestinians. That was a major issue. But all of a sudden, though, we continue to do this, even when there's an opportunity to maybe say we need to do less UN. They're not a peacekeeping force. They participate in warmongering more than peace, and therefore they say, well, this is a good time to make the point that we don't like Palestinians, and we won't even allow this thought that they may be considered in negotiations and discussion about their homeland and where many have lived. At the same time, their homeland is shrinking and shrinking. So the myth here is that the UN deserves any credibility and that they actually bring about good things. It's used, for certain things. The first use of the UN, as I recall, was getting us involved in the Korean War. Our Congress didn't declare war, but the UN declared war, and of course that led to a disaster, and it continues to be a problem for us. So this is something that we should continue to address and realize that we don't need these international organizations like the United Nations, and that they do a lot more harm than good.
Finally, Dr. Paul, we're going to finish up. Your friend, James Grant, he pointed out the obvious this week in an article, and I was amazed to see that it was printed on the cover of Time magazine. And he basically pointed out that America is insolvent. And predictably, the left went ballistic. I mean, they couldn't contain themselves. And they're coming up with excuse of how America is solvent. And there were so many to choose from, but I grabbed a quote from a former Clinton administration official, Robert Reich, and this is how this is his argument. He says, quote, "The federal debt is dropping relative to the size of the U.S. economy. The debt is growing at about 3% a year, while the economy is growing at 3.4%, which means it's sustainable." Now, Dr. Paul, please dispel this myth.
Well, as long as we believe those kind of arguments, the welfare warfare state is sustainable until the total bankruptcy erupts and engulfs us. It makes no sense. The two numbers are actually wrong. Because the debt is not measured by the national debt. That's just a minor part of it. It's the unfunded liabilities, which are so much greater. We owe almost $20 trillion on a national debt, but there's $210 trillion of unfunded liabilities, which is the real debt. But the other thing is the GDP numbers make no sense whatsoever. They claim that the GDP is growing. Well, if the GDP was growing and things were so well, why are so many people angry? They're angry in this election cycle more than ever before because there are a lot of people hurting, and there's a lot of imbalances, and there's too much debt. I mean, the country, just because we can print money doesn't eliminate the fact that we're insolvent, just like Detroit is insolvent, as well as Chicago and these other cities. But we can paper it over for a while. But the GDP is a fiction, because if the government prints money or spends money and runs up debt, the GDP goes up. So if they build more weapons for war, the GDP goes up. So you buy tanks and planes and bombs and drones and send them around the world, causing a lot of trouble and destruction. The GDP goes up because we built those things, and they don't shrink it because the stuff is destroyed, but never helps the people here in this country. Also, they claim there is no price inflation. Well, there's plenty of price inflation. There's going to be a lot more, and they want more. But the price inflation, if gasoline goes up in price, which eventually it will and is already starting to do that, the GDP will go up. Oh, they spend more money on gasoline. So it's a total fiction, and they have to realize that the debt is bad. Besides, if you use the GDP, and let's say they were more honest than they are, the government doesn't own the GDP. They own the ability to tax us, and there's always a limit to that. And they can't keep up with it because the GDP theoretically belongs to the people, and they have to extract that from the people. So the other important thing to recognize is, where does the debt go? The debt obligation, or the unfunded liabilities, but government borrows to consume. They never borrow to produce. So they borrow, and it's all spent and in the wrong way. It causes a malinvestment. Sometimes the money just goes into the stock markets, and Wall Street benefits. And that'll all represent, a part of the GDP. But government money, the money that the government gets, is used for consumption. And but if a growing country or a growing business borrows legitimately and takes some risks, and people take risks in loaning money to these individuals, and to produce a new plant and build highways or railroads or hotels or something legitimately, and it's a good business decision, that is not, all debt is not equal, and all debt is not bad. But all government debt, I would say, is very unequal and very damaging to the people, because the burden always falls on the people, because all the debt gets liquidated. It gets eliminated, and that's what Jim was referring to, that we're insolvent. So the sooner we liquidate the debt, the better. But that is what won't happen, because even though that a lot of people might recognize this, that we needed the correction and liquidation of debt politically, it's not going to happen. You know, you can't cut food stamps. You certainly can't cut food stamps for the poor and for medical care. You can't cut food stamps for the wealthy. They run the show. You're not going to cut back on building airplanes, so that there won't be any cut. So how do you get rid of the debt? Are we going to work harder? No, the economy isn't working very well. They can't even keep up with what's going on right now. So the only way debt is liquidated under these conditions will be not by default. See, a city, Detroit, they can default and wipe some of the debt off the books. Businesses can do that, but governments don't do this. What they do is they liquidate debt by paying the debt off with money that has less value. So if they could tomorrow create 50% inflation right now and double the price of everything, the debt shrinks by 50%. So real debt goes down. That's what they're struggling for. That's why they're begging and pleading and practically praying for prices to go up. But they can control the supply of money. They can control the inflation, but they can't control where it goes and what it does and where the next bubble is. So this is the big problem. Jim is absolutely right. It's totally insolvent. The debt has to be liquidated, and it won't be under these conditions. But to say, in a very narrow sense, if you say, well, let's look at the national debt and look at the GDP, and they're going up about the same rate. Well, the truth is the government could probably make the GDP look whatever it wants. If they needed to double the GDP and make it look good, they just double the spending. So the government spending represents, 20-30% of the GDP, which means it's all negative. Instead of it being a positive when the government spends, that's actually negative, because the government takes the wealth out of the community. The government spends it, wastes it, instead of allowing it in the community to build something very productive. So there's indeed a myth here that says that ordinary debt, the national debt, as long as it grows at the same rate as GDP, everything will be all right. That's pure deception. It's bad economic policies, and it will continue the process that we're locked in on now. So things aren't going to get much better until it's recognized that this thing is going to come unglued, it's going to break down, and you will see the liquidation of debt, which will by that time be much more painful than we have seen in a long time. But Chris, I want to thank you once again for being with us today on Mythbusters. It's great to have you.
Thank you again, Dr. Paul.
Wonderful. And I want to thank the audience for viewing today, and I hope you come back soon to the Liberty Report.